दिमाग में केवल कुछ ना कुछ बोलते रहना है। धरती एक महानगरी है, हवा से हवा का झोंका। क्रिमिनल तो हर एक कोई होता है, स्मैक तो चोरी का मौका है, रायपुर में सिगरेट का खोका है, धोनी को कब किसने रोका है, गहरे को ऊपर ही धोखा है, सामान की तस्करी क्या है, तुझे किसने कमाने से रोका है। मेरे दिमाग में क्या है मेरी माँ नहीं जानती, मेरे खून को पता है। कल रात 9:30 बजे 3 रोटी खाई है, लॉर्ड को पता है। डर के आगे जीत इज्जत से बड़ा डर ये कि जॉन को पता है। हरे कृष्णा का बहन तो इस देश में क्या है ये कौन को पता है। हम कीड़ा जड़ी उगाने वाले, आदिवासी जाने वाले, हुड़के पे गाने वाले, मत लूटो हमको मैं हाथ जोड़ता हूँ। गोरगैस चराने वाले, घास करके आने वाले, बाहर बच्चे बेरोजगार, मत लूटो हमको मैं हाथ जोड़ता हूँ। देवता का चाले वाले, गुरुदेव पकाने वाले, अन्न उगाने वाले, बांट करके खाने वाले, रस्ते बनाने वाले, हिमालय घुमाने वाले, मत लूटो मत लूटो मत लूटो हमको मैं हाथ जोड़ता हूँ। हाड़ का युवा बर्बाद ही होता है।
Himachal Abdi Abdi. Kuldeep Sharma and Suku Sir has a photo op together. Shout out Kuldeep Sharma. Okay, we are skipping Jigme Namgyal's successor, the first Druk king, because he doesn't know Hindi, and if somebody from his side comes for me, I won't be able to communicate with him directly because I don't know how to speak Dzongkha. But his Jigme Namgyal's grandson learned Hindi. So we will go with the grandson, aka the second wife of Ugyen Wangchuk's son. It is so hot. Alu Dorje was a son of Kawang Mangkel, who was an ally of Jigme Namgyal until he was killed after usurping the position of the Paro office. After his father's death, he was brought up by his father's younger brother, Lam Tsewang, who guided him and kept him as a faithful supporter of Jigme Namgyal. He fought heroically on the Timbu side during the 1877 to 78 conflict. By 1883, the two loyal friends had risen to the posts of the Timbu and Punaka Zongpons and were the only two powerful figures who were not blood relations of the direct descendant Ugyen Wangchuk. So that is the second son of Jigme Namgyal. However, in a political climate filled with subterfuge, betrayals, and shifting alliances, Temux Bro said hello. H, something that looks like a variant, says hi. Who are you talking to? I am talking to the spirits of the United States with Bhutanese history. At this point, it doesn't really matter what I'm saying, but I'm talking. Okay. However, in the political climate filled with subterfuge, betrayals, and shifting alliances, such loyalties rarely lasted, particularly because the two friends had plenty of axes to grind with Jigme Namgyal's family. Alu Dorje's father, Kawang Mangkel, was beheaded with the full consent of Jigme Namgyal, and Phunsto Namgyal's uncle, Damcho Rinchen, was an enemy of Jigme Namgyal. Damcho Rinchen had even taken Ugyen Wangchuk hostage and contemplated killing him in Paro in 1877. The first sign of their descent perhaps came when Lam Tsewang, the 54th Desi, passed away in office, and Alu Dorje installed his candidate, a monk named Gawa Zangpo, as the 55th Desi and his brother as the chamberlain to the Desi. Phunsto Dorje, the Punaka Zongpung, and other authorities in Timbu and Punaka must have endorsed this appointment without consulting Ugyen Wangchuk. He's the direct descendant of Jigme Namgyal. The relationship was also strained between the authorities in the capitals. There are two capitals. And Ugyen Wangchuk, because the latter was denied his rightful share of the British subsidy. At this point, the British are giving them money for some reason. This was the main cause of rupture, between Ugyen Wangchuk and his rivals, according to a certain Mr. White. The immediate cause of the bitter breach in their friendship and cooperation, however, was certainly because of a woman A wealthy woman named Dechen Zangmo, Ugyan Wangchuk is said to have spotted her when he came to receive his formal appointment as the Tongsa officer from the Desi. He had a brief affair with her, but when he was returning to Tongsa, Phunsto Dorje asked him if he could take over Dechen Wangmo, as Ugyen Wangchuk was by then already married to his cousin Ringchen Pemo, this player. Ugyen Wangchuk gave no answer, but Phunsto Dorje went ahead with his plans to marry Dechen Zangmo. Around this time, his sister also married Alu Dorje, thereby bringing them closer through a marital link. Overcome by their desire for a woman and power, and emboldened by their new unity, the two now seem to have plotted to exterminate Ugyen Wangchuk. It is not clear what made the two think that the second in command in Tongsa, the regional chief of protocol, would carry out a coup against Ugyen Wangchuk. They sent to the officer 800 coins and a letter instigating him to assassinate Ugyen Wangchuk for money. But this officer was loyal to his master and candidly exposed the treacherous scheme to Ugyen Wangchuk. One source blames Damcho Rinchen, who was still active, for persuading his nephew Phunsto Dorje to rise against Ugyen Wangchuk. He and Phunsto Dorje were said to have put the seal of the Thimphu Zompon Alu Dorje on the letter without the latter being aware of it. Whatever the truth may be, Ugyen Wangchuk responded judiciously, pretending to be unaware of the plot and desiring to find out the truth for himself. He invited his two friends to a meeting in Shar Valley, halfway between Tongsa and Thimbu, where he went to meet them with gifts. The two did not show up, and Ugyen Wangchuk was now convinced of their dissension and scheme to get rid of him. He returned to Tongsa and began the preparations for what was to become the last civil war in the medieval history of Bhutan. Sir says bye. Okay. Having gathered a force of about 2,140 men and made prayers and offerings to protect their deities in all major temples in Bumtang and Tongsa, Ugyen Wangchuk marched with his troops to Punakha in the beginning of 1885. His cousin Dawa Paljor and half-brother Jampa also joined him with their troops from Paro and Wangdi respectively. As the forces advanced to Punakha, the clergy, led by the 41st Jed Kempo Nawang Doden, came out to dissuade Ugyen Wangchuk from attacking Punakha, but they failed to deter him. Ugyen Wangchuk requested the monks to return to the zone and carry out, with expenses paid by him, a 3-day supplication to the state gods, exhorting the deities to be impartial jury, to vindicate the right side and to punish those who are wrong. On one side were the Tongsa Punlop, Paro Punlop, Wangdi Punlop, and most other minor Zongpons, Wangdi Zongpon, also an official position. And on the other, the two Zongpons of Thimbu and Punakha, the Chamberlain of the Desi, and the Chief State Councilor, the former Zongpon Damcho Rinchen, and the Zongpons of Gasa and Lingxi. The deities, later historians tell us, were clearly on Ugyen Wangchuk's side, as a fresh rupture occurred among the enemy camp in Punakha for no good reason. A baseless rumor spread that Alu Dorje's chief warrior was covertly supporting Ugyen Wangchuk and not his boss, Alu Dorje. Thus, Alu Dorje's men tried to corner the warrior, but he escaped to the residence of the state chief of protocol for protection. When they pursued him there, the bodyguards of Shabdrung Jigme Namgyal thought it was an attack on the state chief of protocol and joined in to fight off Alu Dorje's men. The Punakha and Thimbu forces were thrown into an internal chaos even before they confronted Ugyen Wangchuk's forces. The forces of Ugyen Wangchuk and his enemies clashed for 2 days. On the first battle at Zompaka, only one soldier was killed and another injured on the side of the two Zompons. The second day, clash at Jilingang saw the death of 4 men on their side, but Ugyen Wangchuk's party suffered no casualty. Jigme Namgyal, who was then holding the golden throne of Prince Regent and teaching in Punakha, wrote about the conflict. As for the lords of the center, east, and west, time ushered the fruits of their actions induced by 5 poisons. Thinking I am great and high, their hatred blazed like fire. Jealousy and rivalry among them flurried like wind. Intoxicated by the poisonous water of pride and arrogance, they destroyed the peace and happiness of the southern land. The country is turned for once into a real city of asuras in this capital, resembling a nest of snakes. I shed tears from the fuming smoke of attachment and hatred. Having concluded the sermons for my dependents, I return to Sa Na Choling, the happy grove of Vidyadharas. The poetic account of Jigme Namgyal, albeit a first-hand report, may be slightly misleading in portraying the conflict as widespread and tumultuous for the whole country. From the number of men killed and injured, we may assume the battle was a symbolic contest rather than a full-scale combat, and loss of lives was kept to the minimum. The civil wars of Bhutan were not generally so rampant as to directly disrupt the daily lives of ordinary people, although there were indirect consequences through levies of tax, corvée, conscription, and looting. It is surprising, if the accounts are correct, that not a single man, over 200 men, fighting on Ugyen Wangchuk's side was even injured. At the end of the second day, the forces of two Zongpons were on retreat. Unable to hold Punakha any longer, they departed to Timbu, where they put up a strong defense. Ugyen Wangchuk and his men now pursued their enemies to Timbu, but as they descended from the slopes, Alu Dorje's men set fire to the forest. To hinder their advance, the invading troops were held in the hills for one night with no camps or resources. Even Ugyen Wangchuk did not have anything to eat and had to share the dry buckwheat bread, zampa, which one of his servants called sampala, so they have a different name for it. The next day, Ugyen Wangchuk and his men marched southward and took over the Sentoka Zone with little difficulty, as its Zongpon was absent. With this zone as their base, the forces of Ugyen Wangchuk now launched their attacks on the forces of the two Zongpons. Before doing so, according to Mr. White, Ugyen Wangchuk first made a bold overture by visiting his adversaries at Jashicho Zone with his demands, but they refused to listen to him. The two parties clashed in Longtempu on the first day of the conflict in Timbu, when, we are told, two leading warriors of the Timbu party were shot dead, and the rest instantly fled like a flock of birds struck by a stone. Once again, the clergy intervened to negotiate a peaceful settlement. The two parties agreed to have a truce and started negotiations on the knoll in Changling Mentang the following day. Ugyen Wangchuk's party was represented by Dawa Paljor, the Ponlop of Paro, and Phunsto Dorje represented the Timbu Punakha coalition. Ugyen Wangchuk's party offered to provide a luncheon during the meeting. Unfortunately, Phunsto Dorje's day had a bad start when his pony hesitated to cross the stone bridge over the brook in Chubachu. His servants interpreted this as a bad omen and asked him to cancel the meeting, but he persisted. At the meeting, the monastic mediators and the two representatives with their teams sat in a row, and after some discussion, lunch was served. Among those serving the meal were the chamberlains and chief of protocols, 6 officials fully prepared for combat. After the meals were served and while the guests were enjoying the food, Ugyen Dorje, under the pretext of serving, went approached Phunsto Dorje and struck him with a sword. The strike did not incapacitate Phunsto Dorje, as he managed to hit back. Luckily for Ugyen Dorje, he was hit not by the cutting edge, but by the spine of the sword, which caused a superficial bleeding. Meanwhile, his companions joined him to hack Phunsto Dorje to death. The attack caused a commotion, and several men on both sides were killed in the skirmish. It is not clear if Ugyen Wangchuk was behind this treacherous plot to curtail the peaceful negotiations or was even aware of it. It is also not clear if this was a premeditated treacherous scheme, as most Bhutanese sources present, or a skirmish that flared up by accident. At any rate, Phunsto Dorje was killed, the negotiations stopped, and fighting spread quickly in the area. Ugyen Wangchuk, who was waiting not far from the venue with his forces, now actively joined the battle. At one point, his side was beginning to waver, but he was surrounded by his enemies. He fought with renewed vigor and courage. Ugyen Wangchuk fought with renewed courage. His brave leadership inspired his men to fight, as it impressed those against him with fear. By the end of the day, the enemy forces were routed and their leaders fled the scene. The enemy soldiers who were caught were brought to Changlingmetang ground, disarmed and made to crouch through the archer weapons. Such a humiliating act is believed to dispossess the enemies of their luck and good fortune. The Battle of Changlingmetang and the last fully armed conflict between Bhutanese magnates was over with a decisive victory to Ugyen Wangchuk in 1885. By the force of common karma and fruition of negative actions, wars of attachment and hatred raged like the waves of a sea. The congenial friend who was dear to my heart, Phunsto, the Zongpun of Punaka, had entered the path of death. Having lost his power, Dorje, the Zongpun of Thimphu, with his following, had departed for the realm of Tibet. The turn of events which Tenzin Lindop sadly lamented was for Jigme Namgyal a source of some pride and joy. When the gust of heat of the four elements was about to destroy the crops of human body, the Lord of all directions with their retinues converged on Timbu to wind up their battles. There they showed spectacles of arrows, spears, and swords, and filled the day and night with roaring noise of guns. Ugyen Wangchuk was like the god Indra. The sun of his body radiated on the eastern ridge. The lotus of his ministers and subjects blossomed. Through the power of infallible truth, he was a victorious person in war. The banner of victory from all quarters was raised. The eon of warfare and weaponry came to an end. The conclusion of the Changlingmetang battle brought an end to an incessant internal strife in Bhutan and ushered in a new political paradigm. Ugyen Wangchuk now fulfilled the task of firmly consolidating the power with no rivals. Okay, next chapter. The reign of Jigme Wangchuk. Prince Jigme Wangchuk got his initial instruction in literacy from a personal tutor. When he was 9 years old, Jigme Wangchuk attended the new school in Wangding Choling with some 14 friends. In this school, he also learned Hindi and some English under his two teachers, Norbu, who was appointed as the Bhutanese agent in Pasaka, and Pentok from Sikkim. The most notable outcome of this school education was Jigme Wangchuk's ability to communicate with his Indian and British counterparts in Hindi, a skill which would come in handy in the years to come. In addition, he also received religious teachings and instructions from numerous religious masters and became well versed in monastic rituals. However, his main education was the traditional upbringing and grooming he had, like his father before him, by going through the rigors of court life, starting at the lowest rung and waiting on his father. By 13, he was appointed as chief of prodigal in Tongsa, under his father, King Ugyen Wangchuk, who was still in office as Tongsa Phunop. In this capacity, he was primarily responsible for the management of visitors sought with his father. Sometime in 1923, at the age 18, Jigme Wangchuk was formally promoted to the position of the Tongsa Phunop. In the same year, his nephew and first cousin, once removed, Tsering Peljor, was also appointed as the Paro officer. It was around this time that an internecine marital alliance was again made to reinforce kinship ties. Jigme Wangchuk was married to Phunsto Choden, the 14-year-old daughter of his first cousin Demcho, who in turn was the daughter of his aunt Choden. This was an unusual practice. According to local concepts of kinship, her mother, as a direct cross-cousin, would have been the appropriate candidate, and Phunsto Choden would be his niece. However, this marriage enhanced the familial relationship. Phunsto Choden's father was Jamyang, a scion of a family in Ura. By the time Jigme Wangchuk became the Tongsa Ponlop and married Phunsto Choden, King Ugyen Wangchuk was seriously preparing for a smooth succession of hereditary kinship. It seems he had even thought of abdicating the throne. By doing so, King Ugyen Wangchuk would have ensured the safe passage of the throne to his son and quelled any ambition to become the king which his grandson Tsering Peljor may have had with support from Tsering Peljor's father Dorje. However, King Ugyen Wangchuk's health failed before he could see this through, and he passed away in 1926. Before his death, King Ugyen Wangchuk had successfully liaised with the British and his representative Sonam Tobgay to secure their backing for Jigme Wangchuk. It was thus with their support and with some urgency that Jigme Wangchuk now made plans to ascend the throne even before the remains of his father were cremated and the funerary rites completed. Jigme Wangchuk and his entourage traveled to Punakha in the early part of 1927 bearing gifts for the state monk body. A copy of the Buddhist Kanjur and Tanjur canons, sets of silk costumes for the mask dance, and Mintun bull. I think that's a cow, a bull, a cow. Okay, on 14th March 1927, Jigme Wangchuk was formally installed as the second Juk Gyalpo or Dragon King in Punakha in the presence of Jigme Dorje, the sixth mind incarnation of Shapjung, Jigme Namgyal, the 58th Jed Kempo, and almost all leading dignitaries except the brother-in-law. The British also sent representatives with the insignia of the Indian Empire to the new king. Bailey noted about the coronation some stuff. The king had a significant collection of firearms in possession to resist any rebellion. It is difficult to say if the British accounts of the tension are accurate or exaggerated, but with successful completion of the coronation, Jigme Wangchuk became the undisputed ruler of Bhutan. King Jigme Wangchuk turned his attention to the extensive funerary ceremonies he carried out for his late father. As part of his offering, he built a copper turret on the central tower of Punakha and gilded this and all statues in the Punakha zone with gold. Offerings were also sent to all monastic establishments and temples in Bhutan and Jokang Temple in Lhasa, where a new butter lamp chalice made of gold, the largest one in this temple at that time, was also donated. Finally, the cremation of the remains was held on the grounds of the Korje Temple in Bumtang, with many High Lamas conducting rituals and prayers. The new king took the opportunity of the British presence at the coronation to reinforce the close relationship which existed between his father and British India. Both in Punakha and in Dewatong in the following year, he resumed a discussion with Bailey about Bhutan's development, which his father had pursued, and made further requests for British support. King Jigme Wangchuk could now conduct these discussions directly with his counterparts in Hindi and also had the unflagging assistance of Sonam Tobgay in these endeavors. Jigme Wangchuk also continued the southward orientation of Bhutan's diplomatic association. The British were only too happy to continue the existent political connections and to see a strong government in Bhutan for the sake of stability in their own Bengal and Assam frontiers. They also kept a close watch over the strained relations between King Jigme Wangchuk and his cousin Dorje and his nephew Tsering Peljor, who was the Paro official, but the relationships improved and all fears of disputes over succession disappeared soon after the coronation. In the course of the meeting in Dewatong, King Jigme Wangchuk was taken to Guwahati, where he in 1928 saw for the first time a motor car, a train, a river steamer, and machinery of various kinds, which he took great interest. In the same year, Phunsto Choden gave birth to a son, while the royal couple was living in Tongsa. In fact, this was her second child and the only one who survived. The first was a daughter who died soon after birth, causing much grief to the queen. The birth of Jigme Dorje Wangchuk in 1928 further secured the hereditary line of succession, and the news was greeted with celebrations. In the following year, the king built the new palace of Kunga Rapten in a place halfway between the Tongsa Zong and the Yongzhong Choling Palace built by his father. The spot was earlier given to his grand uncle Dongkar Gyaltsen when the latter was forced to resign after Pema Tenden defeated him in the contest for the post of the Tongsa official. The queen's father took charge of designing and supervising the construction, which was undertaken by the king's officers and courtiers. The Zong became the main winter residence of the king throughout his reign. King Jigme Wangchuk's married life took another turn in 1932, although the royal couple had successfully produced a male heir. The king took the queen's younger sister, Pema Dechen, as his second queen. Such polygamous relationships, particularly with sisters, was common in the country. Moreover, the relationship was probably encouraged for the socioeconomic purpose of reinforcing family connections and retaining property. Following the matrilineal customs of the area, Pema Dechen in fact later inherited the palace of Wangdi Choling from her grandmother Choden, and this palace became the main summer seat of King Jigme Wangchuk's government. The union of the king and the second queen resulted in 4 children: Namgyal Wangchuk, Choki, Deki Yangzong, and Pema Choden. As the second queen's family grew, the king built a separate summer palace for the senior queen in Domkar in 1937. The palace was built on the site of an earlier manor house, which the first queen used as her residence. It was named Jashi Choling. Similarly, in the early 1930s, the king built the palace of Samdrup Choling as the winter residence for the second queen when the court spent its time in the Mangdi regions. These dome structures, including Wangdi Choling, initially built by Jigme Namgyal, Lamai Gompa, and Yongzhong Choling, built during the time of the first king, Kunga Rapten. The new palaces had new architecture. Unlike the zongs built by Shopjung and his coterie in the 17th century, these zongs were mainly constructed as royal residences. The 17th century zongs drew significantly on Tibetan forts and were designed with the dual purposes of being religious centers and fortified strongholds. Externally, they were designed to repel Tibetan invasions, and internally, they certainly had space for intensive religious activity. Thus, the architectural design clearly reflected the existence utility of built space and prevailing socio-political conditions. The new generation of zongs built in the late 19th and early 20th century drew largely on the local architectural tradition in their heavy use of timber and aesthetic designs. As they were mostly built by secular rulers at peace times, they contained much less space for religious activity and also had meager fortification. Their primary function was as royal residences and quasi-administrative centers. The restriction of entry imposed on women after dusk for medieval zongs did not apply to these new zongs, in which the royal women played vital roles. Following the ancient transhumance pattern, King Jigme Wangchuk's court moved between Bumtang and Mangdi districts, staying in these various architectures. No doubt, the migration resembled the movement of the state monks and the court between Timbu and Punaka. The main difference was the procession of people between Timbu and Punaka was mainly monastic, while the files moving between Bumtang and Mangda were composed of lay officials and porters. In addition to the construction of new residential zongs, King Jigme Wangchuk's reign also saw the restoration of the Tongsa Zong in 1930, the Jashigang Zong in 1936, and another one in 1948. The king also commissioned refurbishment of many temples. Like his ancestors, he built a new shrine dedicated to the bull-headed deity Bhairava, or Jigje, in Dzongkar. Jai Bhairav Baba, thank you guys so much for listening, and take care. Bye.